And now we have, as we go from excellence to excellence, as we should, we have the wonderful Dr. David Jeffrey from the University of Liverpool.
Thank you. There should be a PowerPoint. Oh, hey, there it is. Okay, hello everyone. I'd like to, first of all, like everyone else, thank the organisers for this event. It's already been absolutely wonderful. And then after this slight dip in quality, I'm sure it will remain wonderful for the rest of the event. The purpose of this presentation, unlike kind of what's gone before, is to move away from the philosophical and look at examining how post-liberal the Conservative Party is as it stands. So there's two ways I'm going to do this. One is I'm going to look at the recent cohort of potential leadership candidates from 2019. And then I'm going to move on to looking at the voters, because I think we often say, actually, there's a post-liberal term. Johnson was very effective at winning post-liberal voters. The party's going post-liberal, but we don't actually know how many voters we would classify as post-liberal. And I think that's a problem for how we understand post-liberalism. So for the first part, I've looked at the Conservative Party's leadership election 2019, and my rationale for that is threefold. So first of all, they all made a speech, right, outlining their vision. They were not encumbered by having to govern. They were not encumbered by the realities of politics. And in many ways, they could set out their stall for what they wanted to be as a leader before having to worry about actually delivering that through a parliament that at the time was very fractious. And also because the Conservative Party is held up as the only vehicle in town for delivering post-liberal policies. Even though it talks the talk and in some cases might be walking the walk, there's no strong intellectual tradition underpinning post-liberalism within the Conservative Party, very much groping in the dark. So I think this makes the Conservative Party a good case study for this. Let's see. Or not. Is it this big green? Oh, there we go. Okay, right, so, perfect. I don't think there's much point in going over the basics of what post-liberalism is, given the kind of purpose of this conference and the people who are here. But I think it's worth loosely outlining what it is we're looking for in these leadership speeches. So post-liberal politics is more than just left on the economy and right on culture, right? In some ways, one nation conservatism has been doing that for a long time. Although it does sit in the middle section of a Venn diagram of one nation conservatism, ethical socialism. But more than that, it's a concept that goes deeper. It's a politics that centres place, that trusts people with power and resources to shape their everyday lives beyond just relying on the state or on the neoliberal individual. It pushes back against rampant social and economic liberalism, meaning that the state and the market should in some way both be restricted by intermediary institutions. And we heard some of that from Chris's talk earlier. And it argues for a shift from free market capitalism to economic justice, reciprocity. And all of this is underpinned by changing the liberal status quo of what should be the key unit in political life. So it's not the state, as socialists would have you believe, and it's not the individual, as perhaps neoliberals and Thatcherites might have you believe. Instead, that primacy is shared amongst competing units of value, the family, community, as well as the individual. And this reflects real-world attachments that people actually have. And so this diagram here is mainly because I like to include graphs. I think that they're better than words. But it's a very rough placement of where different creeds within political thought in the UK anyway might be situated on a tripartite measure of state, community, and individualism. I'm happy to talk about it more later if anybody wants to do so. So this is a big table, but essentially it shows all the 2019 Conservative Party leadership candidates. I think in the end about 5% of the parliamentary party was a candidate at some point. It's rumoured in future every MP will be a Conservative Party leadership candidate. So good luck, Danny, you've got my vote. And here is just kind of key quotes from their ideological pitch. I won't go into too much detail about all of these people, but we'll see some common themes emerge. And the first one, Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt made a lot of leeway with his claim of being an entrepreneur. As health secretary as well, he wanted to turbocharge capitalism, creating the world's next Silicon Valley, and this should set off post-liberal alarm bells, alongside a social mission of prosperity, not just for its own sake, but for prosperity with a purpose, he said. The Conservative social mission should be education. That's spending more on non-university education, abolishing illiteracy, spending more on defence and maintaining the UK's foreign aid commitments, which is all very noble. But there's no challenge to the idea of free market capitalism within Jeremy Hunt's thinking. There's not even a slight shift away from the liberal orthodoxy of the individual first and foremost. And his offer is essentially, I'll do free market capitalism and I'll use the taxes raised to fund public services. And also, I'm not Boris Johnson. I'm not reckless. And that was his kind of pitch. Similar, Andrea Leadsom, so we're going all the way down now. Her pitch was also to put the boosters on capitalism, reinvest it back into social services, public services. And that's a very one nation approach, isn't it? But there's nothing new to it. There's nothing post-liberal about that. Rory Stewart, I don't know if he's well known outside of the UK. I don't even know if he's well known within the UK, to be honest. But he gave what can only be described as a very strange speech, where he spoke about the energies that he would embody like a kind of yogi healer. He spoke about the energy that comes from prudence, the energy that comes from shame, the energy that comes from seriousness, the energy that comes from action, and the energy that comes from conviction. It all sounds a bit weird, but under this language of energies is a kind of generic one-nation policy proposal as well. Well-run, well-funded public services, sensible fiscal policies, not promising to spend more than you bring in, and specifically anti-Boris Johnson. Anti-Boris Johnson boosterism, anti-Boris Johnson embellishment, in his terms, anti-Boris Johnson lies. But no re-evaluation of the role of society. Mark Harper, who I suspect very few people have heard of, he did not give a speech. He gave a speech come question and answer session where his main pitch was that he was not in the cabinet during the kind of Brexit turmoil years. So it's a bold play, putting not good enough to be in Theresa May's cabinet as a reason why you should be leader of the Conservative Party. And he did not manage to make it work. His pitch was he would build better relations with European partners. But again, very little was actually said about how the individual should operate within the political realm. Michael Gove opened with education, and he spoke a lot about undervalued communities and overlooked families, and that was a motif running through his speech. He speaks about the power of government to help every individual, a muscular state which can force reform and give individuals the chance to be author of their own story. And he draws quite powerfully on his early childhood. He was adopted, and he saw the kind of benefits of a stable family environment and what that can provide to someone. And there were some aspects of Gove's pitch which could be seen to be post-liberal. His economic plan of putting overlooked families and undervalued communities at the heart of everything the government will be doing is, we probably all endorse that, but he's pro-free trade. His Brexit plan will ensure that we negotiate a Canada-style free trade agreement with the European Union and new free trade deals across the globe. It's a compassionate one-nation proposal. Again, a theme that runs through all of these. He's progressive, but he wants to scrap a regressive VAT and replace it with a sales tax. Income tax cuts aligned to our welfare system, so the poorest benefit more. At the time, there were talks of a middle-class tax cut. So it was progressive, but it was not a genuine shift in how we perceive political power. Sajid Javid talks about the party needing a new agenda, one that bridges divides across society and one that recognises the Leave vote not only as a vote against the EU establishment, but also the UK establishment. Javid, in an interesting turn of phrase for a self-described libertarian, said, "I first took an interest in politics when I realised the power of government and the power it had to give people the opportunities they deserve." And it's kind of hard to walk away with a conclusion anything other than he was saying what he thought the crowd wanted to hear in a post-Brexit environment. You get the sense that his idea of boosting productivity and boosting communities was about increasing an individual's economic worth in the market. So communities should be boosted in the sense that they then provide you with the skills or the social capital to go out and do good. Dominic Raab again spoke about what might be described as trust busting. Too often, he said, for too many people, today's capitalism looks like some kind of stitch-up against corporate vested interests. He'd stand up for the economic little guy, liberate startups and strengthen consumer clout. Again, all worthwhile things. But this term, looking after the left behind, seems to be to realise their economic potential, something which they don't do at the moment. Matt Hancock's pitch was probably the least post-liberal. He is essentially a techno-utopia, a utopiast rather. He was built around optimism about the reliability of progress, the role of technology in promoting progress, and he's quite excited for the potential of disruption that arises from technology, of social, of societal disruption. And his vision really leaves no space for the local. He talks about the national community, but not communities. He doesn't care about Burke's little platoons unless they wanted to develop an app or make a startup. So his pitch, again, revolves around boosting capitalism as it stands. Now, Esther Mcvay, a fellow Scouser, I was the one I was most excited about analysing, because I thought here is where we should see some element of post-liberalism. Her blue-collar conservatism group is often held up as a prime example of working-class conservatism, of post-liberal thought. And she gave her speech to the Bruise Group, which is a pro-Brexit, pro-Thatcher organisation. And she spent 90% of her speech, in terms of words, talking about Brexit, talking about why we needed to leave the EU and why no deal was good. And that is very much the definition of preaching to the converted. Her 10% of her speech promised a pay rise for public sector workers, more police and more money for schools, and to cut the foreign aid budget to 2010 levels. There was nothing about the role of the individual within society, of communities. It was a Brexit speech. And then Boris Johnson, less important perhaps because we've seen how he governs, so we don't really need to look at his speech. But like with others, Johnson doesn't in any way discuss the role of the individual, the role of communities, how political power is organised. Instead, he offers Brexit as a way to unleash the UK's animal spirits. So there's not much there in any of these leadership candidates to say there's a post-liberal turn amongst the elite, which is something Philip wrote at, I think, just after the 2019 election, where you said the Conservative Party will be dragged essentially into a post-liberal position by its voters, but they don't believe it. It's a political response. So we see kind of two sets of trends. One was whether we should leave the EU with no deal, or that should be kept on the table, or whether we should try to negotiate. That was a key divide. And there was a general agreement that austerity has come to an end, or should come to an end, and a general consensus that more money should be spent on public services, just slightly different levels of tax and spend. All candidates sought to use capitalism, boosted by post-Brexit free trade deals, to generate higher tax incomes, to spend on public services, or to cut taxes. And when it comes to social issues, there was very little difference there at all. So no example of post-liberal value within these leadership candidates. Okay, now the more quantitative section is the challenge of measuring post-liberalism. So if party elites aren't speaking the language of post-liberalism, what about voters? We often assume they are. The British election study asks a series of questions which allows us to gauge left-right placement, which is the first set of questions, authoritarian, libertarian values, and populist positions or populist values. Now, the left-right economic scale might get to the economic element of post-liberalism. It might help us uncover that. But the authoritarian element and the populist element don't really get at what it means to be a post-liberal. It doesn't seem to get at the value for tradition or of belonging or of community. So instead, I looked at a series of questions that were introduced in one wave of the British election study. I'm sorry for the tables, but I want to kind of cover my own back. And there are two sections here. One is around the questions of community, and one is around the role of incremental change, or what we might understand as respecting tradition and established way of doing things, seeing value in those. And I think it's important to try to measure these type of things, because being able to measure, being able to build scales allows us to move the debate around post-liberalism or expand it from the realm of political history and political philosophy into political science. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about populism so much, because we can measure attitudes towards it. And so we can expand it into new realms of political science. So what I did is I ran a series of factor analyses to look at any underlying personality or identity or ideational trends that these values were picking up, and whether they could be meaningfully seen as post-liberal. And these are the bottom 6 here. So we've got whether you emphasize strong marriages and families that make real freedom possible, or whether freedom is about people making their own choices without any kind of obligations. We've got sticking with established ideas that have proven their value, or always trying to do new ways of doing things. Again, established traditions. If ideas have been around for a long time, they probably need to be updated, or they have wisdom in them. The world is always changing, so we should adjust our view of moral behaviour, or the idea that moral behaviour is broadly fixed. And then young people today don't have enough respect for traditional British values. All of these get at some element, I hope, of post-liberalism as we might understand it. So what can we do with this? Well, this scale, internal kind of test, showed that it had a reliability measure of 0.7, which isn't great. I'll come back to that later. But it's compared to about 0.8 out of 1 for kind of the measure of populism, which the British election study approved. So it's not too far. It's not an awful scale. I like to say that. But it does get at something, I think, post-liberally. And we can combine this scale with the economic scale to create a political compass that has the top left quadrant as our post-liberal quadrant, and then the bottom right quadrant as a kind of neoliberal, and so pro-individualist right-wing economics, right? And these are going to be shown here. So this slide shows 2 graphs. The one on the left is the average placement for voters by party along our left-right at the bottom and post-liberal scale. And so essentially we see here that only the Conservative Party and Reform UK can be seen in the post-liberal, their voters anyway, can be seen in the post-liberal quadrant. All other parties are less post-liberal but are left-wing on economic issues. And it's worth remembering that actually voters within the UK are to the left economically. So this isn't, that's not an error, right? The UK is just a left-wing economically, it's a small economically conservative country. The chart on the right is harder to make out. I didn't quite know the size of the screen that I'd be using. If I knew it'd be this big, it'd be clearer. But it essentially shows how the Labour Party in red and the Conservative Party in blue have shifted over time. What's very clear is since 2005, Labour has become less post-liberal and more left-wing over time, reliably. Whereas the Conservatives have kind of hovered in the same position. After 5 years of governing with the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives became a bit less post-liberal, a bit more economically centrist. But in 2019, they were their most post-liberal, their most left-wing economically, which is where we'd expect them to be. So this scale does seem to look like we'd expect it to look like. And my favourite set of graphs. These graphs show the ideological spread of voters within each political party. So the darker shade of blue shows where the middle 50% of Conservative voters reside on this ideological space. And then the lighter shade shows 75% of voters. And what we see here is that Conservative voters are pretty much, about 2/3 of them are in the post-liberal quadrant. They can be identified as post-liberal. And it shows the width of the Conservative appeal, that they also attract some neoliberals, some more economically right-wing, but kind of post-liberal socially voters. But they've got a broad voter base compared to Labour, who are essentially trapping themselves in the very, very bottom left of the graph. And then on the right, we see Leave and Remain. And as we'd expect, Leave voters, so that's the kind of light blue colour, Leave voters are much more post-liberal than Conservative voters as a whole, but also than Remain voters. And so again, I think the scale gets at something, but I feel like it might have also raised more questions than it answered. So my final slide is a call to arms, is that post-liberal values do seem to be, using my scale, more widely held amongst Conservative voters than Labour voters. Good. What we've been telling each other is right. Well done. Also amongst Leave voters than Remain voters. Despite this, it's not well reflected within the Conservative Party elite. That's fine. But if we want to move the discussion of what post-liberalism is forward, I think we might need to start looking at the quantitative side of things. And I think that involves developing a bespoke scale to try and get at those values. This might be a problem while we still have a fuzzy definition of what post-liberalism is, but I think it's a really important part of this political project to be able to measure it. And so, with that in mind, I'd like to issue a call for collaboration. Is that I'm interested in taking this forward, and I know sources of the source of money, and there's also social surveys that we can piggyback on to submit scales to. But if anybody's interested in doing this type of work as a group of scholars, of practitioners, of whatever, please, let's have a conversation, because I think there is definitely some mileage in this. I've seen the time's gone red. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you very much.
So I'm enormously grateful to David for proving that we're not all involved in some tilt at windmills, that there really is a post-liberal majority. The idea that 75% of our voters are in the post-liberal quadrant, when arguably less than 5% of our parliamentary party is quite a divergence, and I think extremely interesting. So thank you, David.